So I'm really excited to be here and to start off this conference. My name is Joe MacDougald. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Law here at the University of Connecticut School of Law. On behalf of the school and Dean Paul, I'd like to welcome you here, and also on behalf of Syma at Avery Point, our co-conspirators and co-sponsors at all times. Today's conference, I think, is very special. I think the fact that there are so many of us here probably tells us it's a topic that we're eager to talk about. It's special both in the topic itself as well as in the structure of the conference. So the topic, climate mitigation, is something people talk a great deal about. Those policies that say we should reduce CO2 emissions, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, much has been said about it, but that's not what we're talking about here today. Today's topic is climate adaptation. Climate adaptation recognizes that even if every country starts to control their greenhouse gas emissions, that we would still be dealing with changing sea levels, changing weather patterns, changing natural challenges that go forward. So climate adaptation poses the hard question. Well, if climate change is coming, what are we going to do about it? And that's what we're talking about here today. Justice John Paul Stevens recognized in Massachusetts versus EPA, the case of a few years ago, that a well-documented rise in CO2 corresponds to a well-documented rise in global temperatures. That recognition was a big deal because it gave the imprimatur for administrative agencies and policymakers to go ahead and begin to regulate and to consider climate change with the blessing of an authoritative body. So I think it's too little that we talk about climate adaptation, but not too late. And this, I think the fact that we're talking about it here this morning is the beginning of what surely to be a larger conversation here in Connecticut. I said the conference itself is a big deal, and it's certainly special because it represents something different, something we haven't done very much. First of all, this is a joint conference between the University of Connecticut School of Law and the Sea Grant program at the University of Connecticut at Avery Point. Our presenters are a combination of legal, policy, hard science, social science, academics that are coming to talk about this problem. And climate adaptation is complicated and pervasive. So really, I think that's the way that we should be talking about it. The other group in the room that is unique, aside from the presenters and the organizers, is the audience. I say this kind of thing with a little bit of trepidation. You don't want to sound like, a comic on a cruise ship. How about the audience? But truth be told, I've had the benefit of seeing who's here. And we have, I think, an all-star group of attendees that are out there. Sitting among you are a combination of social scientists, climatologists, law professors, engineers, lawyers, state legislators, eventually a sitting United States senator, and municipal policymakers. Frankly, when we were conceiving who would come to the conference, I don't think we would have dreamed up a group so good. So selfishly, we wish to put you to work. What we'd like to do at each of your places is a pad, and on the top of the pad is an email address. Throughout the conference, we would ask you to either write on the pad and we'll collect them at lunch, or you can place them in the idea box, which is located at the bottom. Or if you're feeling particularly eco-efficient, if you would send an email to the email address. We'd like to know the top 2 or 3 priorities from your individual perspective that you think have the biggest bang for the buck, the biggest priority urgency when it comes to climate adaptation. The transactions of this conference will be published. Actually, we're in the happy circumstance of having several groups that are eager to publish what we do here today. And we want to make the audience's recommendations part of that publication. We'd like to gather them, study them, and come across the recommendation. So more than just a popularity contest of who thinks what, I think there's a great deal of value given the disciplines that are actually here in the room today. Lastly, it's also my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Syma Ebbin. Syma called us some months ago and said, we should really do a climate adaptation conference. We said, well, if we got 40 or 50 people, it might be a really good idea. That would be a big success. I think had our crystal ball been able to foresee a storm-challenged climate adaptation demonstrated state without power, then maybe it would have occurred to us that the room might fill. As some of you may know, we actually eventually had to shut down pre-registration as we thought we would press 200 people. So I think the fact that we could bring so many people here together has a lot to do with Syma's original design. Dr. Ebbin is part of the Sea Grant program at Avery Point. She has a BA from Williams College in Biology, a Master's in Fishery Science from the University of Alaska, and both a Master's in Environmental Management and PhD from Yale University. She's been a tireless advocate for climate adaptation, both in her academic pursuits as well as the group she's involved in, the many groups she's involved in around the state. So please welcome me in welcoming Syma Ebbin. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. And I want to also welcome you all here today, and thank you for coming. It's really, I got to agree with Joe, we've come a long way when a conference on climate change adaptation can tempt over 150 people to take a day off from work or spend the day inside on a glorious February day like this. So this is pretty amazing. And I have to say, in 2000, when I worked for IJEC, which was an international project on the institutional dimensions of global environmental change, one of our 3 flagship activities was focused on climate change, and that was called carbon management, and it focused entirely on mitigation. We held a meeting in Bali in 2002, and at the time I heard rumors that developing countries were not looking at mitigation at all because it was too late, too little, and maybe would never come. They were focusing instead at that point on adaptation. They were trying to figure out basically how they were going to survive in the face of a changing climate. And here we are 10 years later in a developed country, the US, starting to think about adaptation as well. And I think that's a good thing, since we're no farther along on the mitigation part of the equation than we were 10 years ago. Joe also said that this conference is part of a collaborative process. And he's right. Indeed, collaboration, partnerships, and leveraging are basically the operating principles of Connecticut Sea Grant, where I work. Connecticut Sea Grant itself is a partnership between NOAA, the university, and the state of Connecticut. And at Sea Grant, we work to foster the sustainable use and conservation of our coastal marine resources here in Connecticut to benefit both the environment and the residents. Sea Grant efforts to address climate change came out of the recognition that climate change is increasingly going to be an issue that demands the attention of our coastal communities as well as all of our traditional stakeholders. And it's becoming more and more evident here in Connecticut that our climate is changing. As Joe mentioned, those 2 big electrically interrupting storms. We know that the average air and water temperatures are increasing, that sea level is rising, but it's really unclear how it's going to affect Connecticut specifically. But it's likely that coastal communities in Connecticut are going to feel the brunt of some of these impacts associated with climate change, such as more severe precipitation events, the impact from storm surge, more erosive, eroding shorelines and drowning wetlands, and impacts to people, our economy, and our infrastructure. Sea Grant has chosen to work on climate change adaptation by building partnerships and drawing together the expertise and resources to create a program that focuses on enhancing the resilience of Connecticut's communities. And we've incorporated climate change into all of our activities in our existing program and embedded it into our outreach, our education, and even our research program. And the idea for this conference even came out of collaboration. Sea Grant convened a regional climate priorities workshop in the summer of 2010, which I was fortunate to attend. We were charged to brainstorm ideas for regional adaptation projects. I was the facilitator of one of these groups, and Brian Thompson, who's in the audience somewhere, I can't see him, but he's the director of the Office of Long Island Sound Programs at DEEP, and he was in my group, and he thought it was important to get an understanding of the existing legal and regulatory structure in Connecticut at both the state and local level, and to identify gaps and obstacles as a basis for assessing the feasibility of adaptation approaches that might be considered eventually. Although his idea didn't rise to the top of the projects that were selected, I thought it was a really good idea. And so when the National Sea Grant Law Center issued the RFP a few weeks later, actually, I thought it would be a good fit for his idea. Now, DEEP didn't want to get involved in the project as a co-PI, but they did want to remain involved. I discussed this idea with my boss, Sylvain, who you'll meet in a few minutes, and he thought it was also a good idea. He referred me to Kurt Strasser, who some of you may know here at the law school, and he then referred me to Joe MacDougald. And that was really serendipitous because it's been Joe's been a terrific collaborator and his partner in putting this conference together. And actually, it wasn't just months ago, it was like over a year and a half ago that we started this process. So first I cobbled together funding, and I must thank now those partners or those entities that helped fund this, starting with the National Sea Grant Law Center, which provided the main portion of funds that are supporting this conference. I also want to thank Connecticut Sea Grant and the Nature Conservancy, who also contributed funds, and the School of Law, which has provided this splendid venue that we're all sitting in today. It's really amazing. Joe and I assembled an advisory committee, which has supported and helped guide us through this process, and I want to thank each of them also for their efforts, and maybe you guys can stand if you want, but you've all really helped us. We have Brian Bidoli. I don't know if Brian's here. There he is in the back. And we have David Blatt of DEP, Sarah Bronin at the law school, Sylvain de Guise at Connecticut Sea Grant, and Adam Walchel at the Nature Conservancy of Connecticut. So together we drafted a competitive call for papers on climate change adaptation in Connecticut, and we issued it last June with a focus on topics such as opportunities and roadblocks to adaptation in existing laws and policies, the interplay between public resource protection and private property rights, using the CCMA or the Coastal Management Act for climate adaptation, rolling easements, ecosystem-based adaptation incentives, land use planning and growth strategies, climate justice, who bears the burden, who reaps the benefits, legal approaches for emergency planning, adaptation economics, who pays and when, reactive versus proactive approaches, and strategies for financing adaptation. So the papers you're going to hear today were basically selected from a slew of abstracts that we received that were submitted in response to this competitive call. And we want to thank all our authors and presenters today also who have taken the time from their busy schedules to write papers and come here today to present their work. And Joe also mentioned these papers are going to be a special issue in the National Sea Grant Open Access Law and Policy Journal, so you're going to be able to see them online as well in the future. And we're also going to put these findings together in a report that we'll disseminate and post online. Then somewhere in there we also organized this conference, and I really need to thank several people who helped out with this, both at Sea Grant and at the School of Law. Peg Van Patten of Connecticut Sea Grant, Bob Mariotti, Julia Dunlap, and Michelle Hellman at the Law School, Alex Judd and Joey Leonard. I don't see them, but there's also a host of students here today who really are kicking butt and helping you guys get everything, helping me keep everything running smoothly. So I really need to thank them. And I'm certain if I mention some people by name, I'm going to skip others, so I apologize in advance. And just want to say this has been a collaboration, and I want to thank everyone individually and all the organizations that contributed. And really, the great thing about collaborative events is I think they're synergistic. There's a real positive synergy that comes out where the outcome is actually greater than the component parts. And so I really do hope that this is going to be the first of many collaborations with my new friend Joe, and between Sea Grant and the Center for Energy and Environmental Law. And now I want to introduce my boss, the director of Connecticut Sea Grant, Sylvain de Guise. And Sylvain serves as the director of the Sea Grant College program, and he's also an associate professor in the Department of Pathobiology and Veterinary Science at UConn. As a Sea Grant director, he oversees the research and outreach and education programs, but he's also been really involved regionally in a lot of efforts on climate adaptation. In fact, today I think he's an interview on Channel 8 is being aired. Is that correct? So he's actually going to be on a climate change interview today if you guys turn your TVs on. But he's involved with the NOAA's North Atlantic Regional Team efforts and the New York Bight planning and Gulf of Maine planning as well. His research focuses on the influences of man-made and natural toxicants on the health of aquatic organisms. He has a degree in veterinary medicine, residency in veterinary pathology, as well as a PhD in immunotoxicology. And these were at the University of Montreal and the Université du Québec in Montreal. So, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sylvain de Guise. Thank you.
This is not the classic for Sea Grant. We went out on a limb and we took a chance. We took a chance speaking with lawyers, speaking with town people, tried to gather a nice crowd and have an informed discussion on topics that may not be the most popular ones, that we may not hear about at conferences all the time. But I think there's a need that has been identified, and hopefully we will learn from each other today and learn about next steps today. So maybe we can take a chance again on something else in the near future. It's always hard to follow Joe and Syma. I guess you detected some enthusiasm, some thoughtful ideas, some very good organizational skills, and some capacity to bring things to where they are now. There's not a whole lot left to say except that we at Sea Grant we have two keywords that were partnership and leveraging. The partnership part, I guess, was evident in the 5-10 minutes of the program, and hopefully is going to continue to be the part of the keywords for today. The committee that organized this is actually a good example of how we try to do things. We're a little bit like 3M. We don't invent Scotch tape. We try to make it better, make it stick better. And we had, when we decided to convene this group, this kind of workshop, we reached out to the academic community, the government community at the state and at the local level, and we reached out to NGOs as well. So I'm not sure who's missing, but if there's anything missing that was obvious, please point it out to me. I'd be happy to try to do better the next time. The mission of Sea Grant is accomplished through 3 functional areas. We do research, we do outreach, and education. We try really, really hard to put those 3 things together. And when we talk about outreach, we not only tell, we also listen. And I hope that we can get into the spirit of Sea Grant today and listen to each other, listen to each other's needs, listen to each other's priorities, so that we can integrate those needs and maybe even try to address them in upcoming events or upcoming opportunities. You didn't come here to listen to me today. There's people that are way more interesting than myself. Part of my job is to introduce Tony MacDonald. Tony is an attorney with 30 years of experience in maritime, coastal, and ocean resource management policy at the local, state, and federal government relations. Tony serves as the director for Urban Coast Institute at Monmouth University, New Jersey. From 1998 to 2005, Tony served as the executive director of the Coastal State Organization, something that you might be familiar with, which represents the interests of the governors of the United States, 35 coastal states. Prior to joining CSO, Tony was special counsel and director for environmental affairs at the American Association of Port Authorities, where he worked on a range of environmental shore protection and navigation matters. Tony practiced law in a private firm in Washington, D.C. for several years, and he held several positions working for the city of New York. Tony is a graduate of Middlebury College in Vermont and Fordham University School of Law in New York City. And if nothing else, I'd like to draw your attention to the first 3 words of his title: make it real. So I hope that not only Tony's going to make it real for us today, but we can keep that thought in the back of our mind through the day and try to make it real through the day, give us suggestions. We want to hear from you, and then even beyond that, try to help us make it real and move forward. Thank you.
Great, thanks. To set this up, I'll just sort of start winging a little bit. Thank you very much. Again, if you can hear a little bit from my background, really, what I do bring to this is actually a long record of working for state and local governments. So that's sort of the perspective I bring. And Sylvain mentioned the first 3 words of the topic, getting realist. The reality is I'm sort of the warm-up act and set the context for this discussion for the real lawyers to come out. For the last 20 years, I've actually been working in the policy and advocacy arena at the state and local in Washington, and now at the Urban Coast Institute in New Jersey. So I actually have spent a lot of time thinking and mostly talking about these issues. So I'm really going to try to get things going here because you all are the ones who I think are really poised, it sounds like, to start implementing some actions, and I think there's some models for everybody to do that. So again, I'm going to apologize at the outset. I'm going to kind of keep us on schedule here. There's a little bit of, maybe a little too many words on these slides, but I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. I'm a kind of recovering New Yorker, so I do speak quickly, so I think I can keep us on schedule. So with that, we'll just get into it. So again, just very briefly, the Urban Coast Institute at Monmouth, I came there 6 years ago from the Coastal States Organization in Washington to actually set up this institute at Monmouth, which is on the Jersey Shore. We're a mile from the beach. And our mission is actually to work on projects like this to essentially serve the public interest. And I think that's really an important, and not just sort of a, it's not a soft kind of action. It's really important about what we're about. And I think it's very relevant to adaptation. And we really do this through collaboration, like our Sea Grant partners, and thank very much to Syma and Sylvain for including me in this session today. But we do bring science to impact policy. So I think science isn't irrelevant. Sometimes it can be very complex, but I'm kind of a real believer in really figuring out where the science comes into the equation. I'll talk about that more specifically. So we focus on a variety of issues at the Urban Coast Institute. We're currently working on, we work with our Sea Grant program actually on visualization projects for local communities. I'm actually working at the regional level with the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council. We'd like to adopt Connecticut down to the Mid-Atlantic sometimes. It's not all New England. You're the gateway to New England, but you also face the Mid-Atlantic, and I think we have some common issues that we can work on in the region as well. But I also think we really are talking about economically vibrant communities. That's obviously a very important theme throughout this presentation, but the other work that we do at the Institute. So really the summary today, I'll talk a little bit, just sort of general thoughts, just sort of setting the agenda maybe for the day, some questions for you to ask as you work through the more particulars. I mean, we're here, this was a former, I think, a seminary and a law school, so it's also very, very kind of makes me a little guilty. I really realize all the things I can do, but the reality is, we really do need to take some of that learning and actually apply it. So I'm going to sort of give you some general ideas from some work that I'm doing and some projects that I'm involved with. I'm going to speak, particularly the adaptation and getting on board. Everybody's doing it. I mean, you guys are really on the cutting edge. So really, there is a lot of activity, a lot of learning that can happen and that you can apply that I'm going to talk about a little bit. And I think some of your presenters, which really seem excellent, are going to give you some ways to do that as well. I'm going to talk specifically about some work I'm working on with a variety of groups. I'm really, how do communities learn? What do they need in order to engage in adaptation? You can't just tell them, you should be adaptive, you should adapt. What do they need? What are the disconnects? Sometimes it makes sense. You shouldn't build it, right? But we have, and we continue to build there. So there's some disconnect there. So it's maybe not as obvious as some of the scientists and some of the policymakers think. So we need to think a little bit more about how do we actually communicate these adaptation needs in ways that are actually going to change behaviors. So it's not about being right, it's about changing behaviors. And then I'm going to conclude with a few comments on a project I'm working on right now, and I know Sylvain is involved with some of this as well, which is some activities going on the Federal National Climate Assessment, which is a really an effort that's going to come out with, I think, some really worthwhile information, and they're actually changing their philosophy. It's not just about the science. It is about informing decision makers about why that science is important to their lives. So I'll conclude with a little bit of some of those thoughts. So again, I would like to talk about really the global changes, and again, this is where I always, having been to a lot of these conferences, I kind of get this sort of like, what's the perspective I'm taking? Because it really is a broad perspective. Climate change is often talked about, and you read about it in the newspapers, in this broad global issue. It's global, it's complicated, it's long-term. But that's not adaptation. The impacts are local, real, and happening now. And that's the reality that I think really is why I think Joe got so much interest in this conference, because they know that. You don't have to tell the communities that that's happening. They're doing it, and they're living it every day. There's also just another reality that sort of I think that I always like to keep in mind. It's nothing overly insightful, but really there is just this, we live in an environment that the messages come across in very complicated ways we just need to be aware of as we're trying to think about it. But the media, there's always these sort of conflicting medias. The media is informing the public, but it's also entertaining and attracting audiences Politicians are motivating, they're doing good, but they are interested in staying in office. Again, that's not a cynical thing, that's a reality, that's important. They want to do their job, they have to stay in the office. Scientists are trying to motivate, grow knowledge, but they're also trying to get funding, so sometimes the funding mechanisms can force you to be sort of overly focused on one issue. And when we're talking about adaptation, we're really talking about a fairly complex and integrated system, as I think Syma suggested. So again, some of our current sort of modes of communication and delivering information here are sort of really conflicted within their own objectives. So we just need to keep our ears attuned to the messages we're hearing so we understand what the motivations behind them are. So really, I think when we're really moving about that, we're trying to define our message. I mean, this is an exercise that you don't want to get ahead of yourself in. You don't do a message until you really know what your plan is and what change you want to do. So don't message about this. This isn't just re-messaging about what we're doing. It's actually understanding at its heart what we're doing and making sure our messages are authentic and relevant to what we do. And I think my view within the community context is that we are improving our outlets and improving the quality of life, that there are things that we are doing now. This isn't new stuff. It's a better, different way of looking at the stuff that we already do as communities and as educators and as scientists. So again, I think there is sort of very specific changes in activities at the personal, community, and national levels that can affect the rate of climate change and the ability to adapt. We can make a difference. This is not so overwhelming, even though it is that overwhelming, but we can, and you can make a difference. And so we'll talk about some specifics, I think, that hopefully will illustrate that a little bit. So here's, again, everybody's doing it. Again, there's any number of reports now. Again, 5 years ago, you wouldn't really, you would Google adaptation or resilience, and you really wouldn't get some. But now it's just like, oh, stop. It's just, there's a lot of work going on in this area. That can be very useful, but we do need to really channel that a little bit. But I do think, again, sort of picking up some themes that will come up throughout these remarks today, is that climate impacts will emerge gradually in many cases. That just is a reality. It's silent, but potentially deadly. I mean, that's really a real difficult public policy challenge for lawyers and policymakers, is that the changes somehow are incremental, but they can be devastating in the long term. And we've had a really difficult time, and again, I can pose a challenge to you to figure it out in later sessions, dealing with cumulative impacts and long-term impacts. So that's just something to recognize. But at the same time, it could emerge rapidly and powerfully. That we really, the scientists are telling us pretty clearly that if we get this wrong, it will be too late. So again, there is an issue that we do need to think about. How do you manage those issues now? I think communities, and I think adaptation is actually a really good ways to start doing this, but I'll talk about that a little bit later more specifically. But mobilizing now to increase the nation's adaptive capacity, really capacity, can be viewed as an insurance policy against an uncertain future. And again, this is that kind of risk analysis issue, which is, again, the reality is if it's a low risk, you're not really sure it's going to happen in the future, but the impact is going to be severe. You do need an insurance policy up front. So adaptation is a bit of an insurance policy. That's one of several ways to think about it, and certainly a way to think about it. But again, sometimes you just need to invest in that insurance, and I'm not sure there's a public support for maybe doing some of the more dramatic things now. But how do you build that support, and how do you keep your eye on that potential dramatic change in the future? A real challenge, I think, in the adaptation and resilient kind of community world. Again, you really need to focus on key sectors, and Syma indicated this is an integrated kind of issue, and this center of energy and environment here, I think that focus is sort of beginning to look at that. I'm sure you also talk about smart growth and sustainable development. There's a lot of other words, a lot of other kind of communities that are looking at issues that are similar to that we need to build bridges with. But we do need to actually break down some of the connections between the agriculture, ecosystems, forestry. Again, we do need to look at all of these aspects. I mean, it might be sometimes urban areas or coastal areas that get a lot of attention, I find in the literature. But again, thinking about how you integrate with some of these other initiatives. And I think transportation, by the way, is key. I mean, in New England, personally, that I'm just doing my own little sales. I think we have so much investment in transportation on a whole variety of scales. We need to think about that as a coastal management and adaptation issue more sort of as a primary theme within that. And again, so sort of repeating some of this, the contingency planning, and the potential need for transformational adaptation. I just want to keep on the screen and hope you will consider that. So you do need contingency planning for high impact, low probability outcomes. You need to be vigilant in monitoring to detect early signals. Again, this is really an issue that I feel gets really left on the table a lot, is the monitoring and information streams, the feedback loops on adaptation approaches and strategies and implementations, building that in very explicit terms. I'll come back to this, but I think that's an issue that gets lost a lot. And the continuous assessments and the adequacy of responses. Again, that's a really important. Adaptation needs to be adaptable. It really is really critical, and I think something that you need to put on your sort of checklist when you develop your plans or do that. Again, maybe obvious, but I think it tends to get forgotten or at least overlooked in terms of the funding and support for it. Again, what you may need transformational adaptations. Again, don't be afraid to ask the big questions. You might not be able to answer them, or there might not be public consensus about responding to them now, but I think it's really a mistake not to put them on the table. Because I do think you do need to be thinking about them and be explicit about why you're not addressing them. Again, a lot of issues with the coastal issues, and I know this comes up in Connecticut, is movement of people and facilities away from vulnerable areas. That's been an issue that's been around for a long time. It's not new. I don't see it gaining a lot of credibility, at least where I live. But when I read the literature, it does suggest that at some point that's going to be important. That's going to be inevitable at some point in some areas. I don't know what that point is, but don't forget to ask the question and make sure that, again, you're setting it up and considering when and how you make that transition over a period of time, if you have to. You might not in some cases. Changes in community ecosystems and land and management objectives. I think that's a theme that seems to be running very explicitly through this conference, and I think some of the lawyers and policymakers are particularly positioned to address, again, getting those, addressing the community ecosystem changes. And when I mean ecosystems, by the way, I'm not just talking about natural ecosystems. It's sort of a mistake in people's heads sometimes when they hear about ecosystem management that they think it's environmental management. It's not. It's about humans in the environment as part of the environment, and also the economic values that it creates as a sort of sustainable framework. So I do think that's something you need to start changing your, maybe you don't react that way, but I find that when I speak to audiences that they think I'm talking about environmental only. I do think the revision of water rights and laws, I think that's going to be an issue. The public and private public rights conflicts are really huge, and for the lawyers in the room, I think that's an issue. Jane Stahl was wonderful, and I need to stop back and thank everybody for the incredible warm welcome. I didn't need the cops to pull me over when I told them to ask me if I was drinking, but there was a stop. If you go to downtown Hartford, I guess that's part of the welcoming committee. But I do thank everybody for doing that. But I go back to Jane Stahl, who I was wonderful to see after so many years, who's in the audience, who really was one of the first authors of the Coastal States Organization's Public Trust book. And those principles and some of those issues are still fundamental, but I think are really going to be at the forefront of the climate debate. And also, I think we can start struggling with the issues today and move forward to look at them in the future. This is just too many words. Don't really read them or think about them. But the basic point is, you're not alone here. This is really something that's happening in the corporate and environmental world and funding world. They are there already. Not all of them. But there is a strong, strong trend within the business community, within local governments, within the college and university community, which I'm based at now, to really be thinking of these issues as really fundamental issues, not extraneous issues, not branding issues. So again, I do think you're not really alone here, and thinking about the private sector as a partner in these initiatives, I think is going to be a new challenge and hopefully a new opportunity moving forward. I do think another issue I want to have, sometimes we talk about mitigation. Joe set it up, you need to define mitigation versus adaptation, and we're thinking we're reacting to very particular problems. And we are. But within the coastal and sort of highly developed environments like Jersey, there's a lot of compounding factors to climate that are issues that, frankly, communities are dealing with every day. And so we need to understand better the relationship between the ongoing human activities that result in a more fragile and less resilient ecosystem. So already our traditional environmental management stuff, really, we didn't know it at the time. We didn't phrase it or brand it this way. But we were really trying to make our ecosystems more resilient to change so that they would not collapse, so you wouldn't have sudden die-offs of fish, so you wouldn't find out that your water quality is so fundamentally impaired that you can't swim at the beaches anymore. Who knows what's going into that. So really, we do need to think, and I think connect some of our strategies for adaptation, some of our ongoing responsibilities for really thinking about this concept of how our existing programs make our ecosystems more resilient to change, because climate is going to be a new important factor within those changes that we don't know that much about. We we're doing some really cool work going on to sort of see sort of migration of fisheries. You know, we're all trying to, all the fishermen are fighting amongst themselves and saying, we want this fish. I said, well, those fish are slowly changing their range over time. So what are we really fighting over? Because are we fighting over the future? So we do need to think about the connection of climate to some of our ongoing programs and human activities and these what are called compounding factors of the impacts of adaptation. So it's not a static environment that you're adapting to. It's actually a very rapidly changing environment that actually depends on other things that are going on as well. So again, it compounds these effects and makes it more difficult for the systems and the humans to adapt. So there's a variety of issues. And I sort of talk about this as opportunistic adaptation. Because I do think there maybe are ways, and I'll have some examples of some communities who are looking sort of at adaptation in this way, really building on existing programs. I also think, and this is not going to be helpful, but I'm going to put it out there, I think Joe quite rightly tries to distinguish between mitigation and adaptation, but I think it kind of merges, that sometimes there are mitigation activities that are really more like adaptation activities. So you just need to think about it. It might not be as clear as a line as some of the academics would want us as myself would want it to be, but just think about that a little bit. This is a slide I actually saw from Maryland, and Maryland is a state to look at for a very active response to climate change and adaptation issues. They have a variety of initiatives underway that really are both top-down and bottom-up, you know, that old expression, but they are really the core thing in talking with the Maryland people is that working with the communities, and I know Sea Grant and other groups do that, but really not shortchanging that thing. But what about this slide I just want to point out is this. It really is this thinking about these things in an integrated way and thinking about biological communities, human activities, the weather or the climate stressors and impacts, and their impacts like sea level rise is the one that's illustrated here, and the processes, the science. So this is sort of in real terms. You see a lot of that sort of adaptive management, sometimes, you know, Venn diagrams that talk about science. This is a more real version of that in my mind, and I do think it's helpful to me when I think about the components that have to come into play when considering adaptation planning and also implementation. So again, moving on, I do think we are talking about really looking at this adaptation from a stakeholder perspective and context. I've done some work with Network Coastal Services Center, sort of looking at what really people need in order to absorb this information and act on it. And I do think that essentially there is one thing, and we have some partners here, this is just really an emerging availability of adaptation best practices and resources. NOAA Coastal Services, Georgetown has a website with a whole variety of websites. There is a lot of information, as I said, emerging and available to you. There's an emerging use and sophistication of models and geospatial visualization and scenario planning. I mean, that I think is just a really dynamic thing. The science of modeling has come so far, so fast in really trying to understand some of these interactions. We have a long way to go. Ecosystem-based management and understanding it in the scientific sense is still a huge challenge, but it really has come a long way. And some of these visualizations have really shown in a lot of areas a way not to solve a problem. It's not a plan. It is a way to understand the science in concrete terms and how it interacts to help inform decisions. And it also forms a framework often for really participation of the public, a way for non-experts to get involved in the process. And I think that's really, I think, something that's changed and a real opportunity to think about. But again, I do think this is, I don't have to sell this to you, but I do have to sell it to a lot of communities that I talk to, that the efficacy of these decision support tools, people are always trying to help you. Here, buy our decision support tool, use our visualization tool. You know, that's right, but really the framework for that sometimes is they develop the tool, but they don't, you know, what is the capacity of the local community to use that technology? What is the, you know, really understanding how it applies and how they support and inform policy, planning, and management decisions. So really designing those tools and those visualization products in the context of your planning and management objectives. Again, you can't message unless you know what you want to do. And you can't develop a decision support tool, whatever that may be. That could be a legal analysis, by the way. It doesn't have to be something sophisticated, but you can't develop that unless you really work with communities to understand and define those objectives. You know, what are the design criteria for that? And I think most of the tools out there don't really sort of have the objectives well enough in mind as they do that. So something that I think you need to think about and hopefully will be helpful to you as you think through your planning. So again, adopting the perspectives of the coastal community stakeholders. Again, I'm preaching to the choir here. Again, the general theme that I've mentioned before about the incremental, uncertain variable, not immediate concern issue, which is, I think, really the general public views. I mean, you know, sea level rise, you know, such, oh my God, a meter. And people are like, a meter? That's really not that high. So, you know, what that means, I think we need to think about. But I do think then this is where the sort of the calculus and equation comes in with regard to climate change and the various stressors, whether it was precipitation, whether it is a rising, changing sea level, whatever the cause is, it's happening. We have historical as well as really reliable science in terms of projections. Whatever that forcer is, at what point does that information become an actionable factor at a level of complexity that adds a potential urgency to take action? So I think that's sort of the spectrum that you need to be thinking about, and really be thinking about understanding and using that climate information, or the information about impacts that may be related to climate, but you know that they're impacts. How do you make them actionable at the community level and at the state level? I think the federal government has a role to play in helping us think about that and making that information useful, so they have definitely an information support role, but again, the rubber will hit the road at the local communities. And again, there are significant, I think this is a real challenge here, is sometimes you get a little bit of a kind of a whip snap, because they'll talk about climate change, and then they'll give you all these international, national statistics like IPCC, and then they'll say, and this is why you should do it. But those are global numbers. They don't really mean that much when it comes to making regional decisions. So this is a real challenge, but there is some progress being made, and how do you actually start reflecting these significant regional, state, and local variations, and what those impacts and make them locally relevant. But I think there are ways to do that, and I'm sure there are folks in Connecticut can help you work through that. There's another issue. This sort of is a different way of looking at my previous point about the need to be thinking about both incremental change and also the possibility for more transformational change, the scale of the problem and the scale of solutions. And this is just, again, when you read different adaptation plans, whether Maryland's, California's, Maine's, a variety of other ones that are out there, there's a lot out there. I do think there's a question of scale of the problem and scale of the solution, and thinking about how that works. I mean, I do think we have to think about natural ecosystems and a renewed commitment to natural systems and ecological services at a larger landscape scale. That's really something that's really not on the plate, I don't think. And personally, I think the reason for that is there's really no funding mechanism for that. How do you capitalize the natural shoreline? How do you capitalize a return to wetlands that actually perform functions in terms of protecting against storms? How do you capitalize barrier islands? I see some folks here who are more expert than I in some of this stuff, so I won't tread too deeply in it. But I do think there's a question about this, and this was going to come up in some of your seawall issues, about how do you, living shorelines is a kind of a buzzword right now for some of these types of programs, but I do think in the climate issue is what our fundamental relationship is with the coast, and where these scale issues come in on the natural ecosystems is a really important issue, again, to tee up. You might not be able to tackle it, but if you admit you can't tackle it, then you say, you know what, we're never going to happen. We're just not. That's a choice that a community can make. You know, we can't value judgment of this stuff too much, but it's something to think about. I do think there's going to be urbanized infrastructure and engineered approaches. I mean, the reality is there is going to be a lot more engineering. I mean, one of the good news things, I know our economy's awful, we have a lot more money to respond to these issues than most. We're a wealthy area in the Mid-Atlantics. So the reality is there's going to be a lot of private landowner money and even state money and federal money that's going to invest in highly sort of engineered and structural solutions. I mean, at least that's going to be their first reaction. I don't know if you know engineers. Are there any engineers in the room? Okay. But engineers, you can figure out everything. They can engineer the problem. I mean, you know, they can figure out the solution to the issue. They can engineer it. How does some of the natural issues become an option in the engineering community? I can't get a local homeowner to think about putting in a sort of a more natural area, because it's hard for him to get a permit for that. Because they know the engineering world. They can permit a bulkhead. They have a hard time in New Jersey permitting, and a lot of other places, more natural issues. So again, thinking about what is this trade-off, short and long term, between these engineered approaches and these natural approaches is something that needs to be considered. And I do think this issue of financial and economic incentives, again, like science, I think the financing of these things also tends to somehow be put a little bit on the side. That's not our problem. You know, we don't really understand that. You know, those are forces beyond our control. Well, you better figure out how they work, and I'll sort of talk a little bit about some of that in the long term, because it would be very important to the incentives that business, government, and individuals have to make one choice over another choice. Education, training, communication, I'm kind of really this is a fairly Reader's Digest view of some of the work that's been done on sort of thinking about what local community needs are, but I do think I'm picking out ones that that speak to me personally. I do think the need for a clear vocabulary for mapping needs and other related to climate change is something that's very important, because we sometimes talk about different things about what we're really looking for, decision support tools. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by living shorelines? What do you mean? It's all a little bit confusing. And again, there is this overcoming the public skepticism. I do think the messaging also has to really be thought about. Once you have your objectives, remember, once you have your objectives, once you have your plan, then you do your messages, but they really do need to be very targeted to key groups. So really understanding who your audiences are in order to get actions to change. Again, that's the actions to change. So it's not about being right. It's about somebody doing something different after you talk about them with them. Again, this is a little bit obvious, I think, but for me, I need to remind myself that that's something to keep in mind. And again, I think this is really at the foundation of this session today. Is you do need governance to support those policies. It has to be somebody's job to really think about it. This is the important issue. It's got to be somebody's job. The colleagues in the state of Delaware, they've done really a cool thing. They just made climate adaptation. They haven't started a new program. They just embedded it in every program within the state. So they are sort of trying to embed that within it. It's somebody's job, and they have somebody who's a coordinator of that state effort. Some other states have done similar things. So think about whose job it is to do this. It's not just a one-off. It's not another thing. I don't know about you. I'm really busy. I don't need an add-on. I don't need another job. If you want to refine my job and give me a little bit clearer objective on what to do, that is really helpful. So how do we make adaptation helpful to local governments and other folks by actually making somebody's job and not another thing for them to do? Well, first you need to decide it's important enough that it should be somebody's job. I happen to personally think it is. Hopefully after today, or maybe you're here already because you're at least inclined toward that general direction. Again, I think clear federal state strategy. I'm still a little policy wonk at heart, but I do think we do need the lawyers and others to sort of do some analysis about how our existing laws and strategies do not support that if we know what our objectives are. And some states have done that, but we can do more. And again, continual. It's not one report. It's a continuing sort of adaptation within the policy analysis as well as the science world. And I do think there's opportunities for regional, multi-jurisdictional coordination, action agendas at the regional scale. So again, at some issues, I do think some of this climate data, I'm certainly looking to extend partnerships. We work with Connecticut Sea Grant on some issues having to do with regional science research needs. Would be interested to sort of narrow that down a little bit, talk more particularly about working with some of the communities on some of the science and information needs regionally. For the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council of the Oceans, stops at New York. I apologize, shouldn't, but we have to stop somewhere. But really has set adaptation and climate change as one of their priority areas. And I think the NMOC governors also have adaptation and climate change as one of their priorities. So certainly I think there's an opportunity for collaboration. Actually, technically, the large marine ecosystem for the Northeast actually goes from Virginia to Maine. It's just politically that's too much for people to handle. But technically, we should be working more. This is just not a very good graphic because I'm not as good as my students are at sort of making nice PowerPoints, but it really is just to emphasize, again, this interactive adaptation quality, that this is really a constant dialogue that has to keep moving among these various components. So some of the, again, this is really just one-on-one, but some adaptation issues, again, California, I think, has really been a little bit of a leader in some of the adaptation planning at the state level, looking at resource-based sectors, really sort of putting a value on adaptation. I think that's just really important, and it's not just, again, not just branding, putting a real value added onto the adaptation strategies, indicating that sea level rise can put property and lives at risk, short, medium, long-term actions, again, thinking in those different scales in both temporal and other scales. Again, they have a public-private committee. I just think that really is extremely important, increasingly think about where's the private sector. It's really hard sometimes to get them at these conferences. So I think really thinking very targeted, maybe for your next conference, what's the conference that sets up those private-public partnerships is one I've been thinking about, but I don't know how to do. So if you guys have some ideas, I'd be interested to think about that. And again, this information feedback loop that I keep talking about, again, they have California DAP, a web-based tool for scaled-down climate data. I mean, really convincing people that you are really working off of real information that's going to be making a difference. Again, economic and social issues, again, this is another issue. I think the monitoring sometimes gets left off, the link with financial. The other one, I think the social vulnerability issues get left off as well. I mean, we have a lot of at-risk populations
that really we have a special responsibility to as public servants and others. So I do think we need to be thinking a lot about those social vulnerability, environmental justice issues, and really not put them on the back burner, put them up front. And the social scientists, get them more involved in the research. They say they want to be. It's a little hard to get them to sort of focus on these issues, but something that we need to think about. Again, Maine really has a more sort of not quite as comprehensive an impact, but they really have looked at sort of baseline studies. They do foundational reports. It's just another approach. Do you have the right information on the table? So there's a consensus about the information, but you don't want to have the dialogue around different sources of information. So thinking about that, Maine also really is looking at local vulnerability assessments and built environments. So again, they're really looking, these vulnerability assessments are really critical. They are obviously the foundation for adaptation strategies. So understanding what vulnerability means and also doing those local vulnerability assessments and expressing them with the community. So they're not local, they're saying, by the way, this is what's going to happen to you. It's, don't you agree that this is what's happening to us? So again, really, I think that's a strategy that's worked in Maine and some other areas. Again, it's not quite do that, but they're sort of doing it one community at a time. They're trying to build one strategy, and like California, which is a little bit more comprehensive, they're trying to build it. And really, what are the no regrets actions? We want to make sure that we don't say, you know, I really wish we hadn't built there. You know, I really wish we hadn't done that. So really, no regrets actions is sort of a foundation for the way they approach it. And I do think, again, this is sort of gets to my, the reality is that, again, a sea level context, which I work on a lot, we have broader issues in Connecticut in addition to shoreline, but the reality is that the storms of today are going to be the high-level watermarks of the future. So I mean, that's just, we know that. We know that from historical data. We don't need, we don't even need your sophisticated climate projections to know that. We just know it, and we see it. If you talk to your mayors, at least where I live, they know that the water doesn't go away anymore the way it used to. It does get absorbed. That it's not just the intense storms. It's even the regular flooding events. We had some of the same flooding and water issues than you did. Again, they are using some of these visualization tools. Again, everybody, there's a lot of discussion about what the right one is, but thinking about that. But the data's come a long way. LiDAR, other information, really is a pretty powerful way to engage people around that. But again, don't just put this on people. Oh my God, see this? It tells us. It doesn't tell you anything. It's still a tool. Those visualization issues, and folks really need to know what the assumptions are behind those tools, because they really have to understand not all the science and tech stuff, but they do have to understand the models and the assumptions behind those tools. So the next one really is just to talk about sort of another one that I think is interesting, because I'm going to illustrate sort of one of the points that I talked about earlier is the South Florida Regional Climate Compact. This is actually, these counties were sort of going, they were each going to DC and going to the state legislature and lobbying for investment. I mean, Florida made some pretty bad decisions, I think, from a purely climate issue. I mean, that's not the judgment call. It's like, but, if you live there, it doesn't seem like a bad decision. You love it. If you retire there, it seems a lot warmer than Connecticut. So, I mean, it's a good decision in those terms. But from a purely sort of climate sense and ecological management sense, I mean, Florida's whatever. They didn't do the right thing. But hey, it's a nice place to live, and it's an incredibly prosperous state. But these counties were going and saying, we've made these decisions, now we need to adapt. We actually need to figure out how to do it better in the future, given the hand we're dealt at this current time. We need to figure that out. But they realized they were all working off of different standards. They were all arguing for their own sort of specific issues. They were all have different models for sort of what the impacts were going to be in the community. So they got together and actually formed a climate compact, because they realized they were going to be much more effective working together. So they really they worked together to develop joint legislative policy issues, regional greenhouse gas baselines, so they're all agreed to working off the same assumptions in terms of the mitigation side of this agenda, which you can't forget. I know that's not the primary focus here, but don't forget the mitigation side. Regionally consistent sea level and more rise mapping, regional climate action plan. That's really pretty cool stuff. When I think you guys have some of the same home rule challenges that we have in New Jersey, and getting folks to think in those terms, I think, can be very successful. And also these annual leadership summits, giving people credit, giving people a role. It's not, again, about just the bureaucrats trying to do issues, but really getting engagement from all the sectors. And but their objective, and this is sort of more the opportunistic adaptation that I'm talking about, is their objective is still to integrate climate adaptation and mitigation into existing systems, and to develop a plan that can be implemented through existing local and regional organizations. So they really are looking to, as a first level of focus, to be sure that they are working to integrate this into their current programs. And so they're not asking folks to just come in and do something incredibly dramatic and different. And again, they're looking broadly, pretty simplistically, but I think in a way that makes sense to the built environment, the transportation environment, and the land and natural resource systems, and what their strategies are. And they have a draft implementation plan that's out on the streets with very specific actions. We're going to do this. We're going to implement these regulations. We're going to reconcile these regulations. So it's really, it's a little down in the weeds, but I think very important to set up a framework for broader, more sustained or transformational action. So I think you need to go at it both ways. So I'll conclude with just a few, I think it's a few, I don't know how much we're left here, on the National Climate Assessment. How much more time do I have? Am I running over? You doing okay? Huh? 5 minutes? No. Okay. I'm supposed to stop. Huh? Oh, good. Okay. So, because I want to, if you have a couple of questions, I just want to mention this National Climate Assessment, and I don't know if Sylvain's on a working group as well, but again, really, the federal agencies are trying to get on track for every 4 years to really provide this sort of climate assessment that integrates and evaluates the findings and programs and discusses scientific uncertainties. I mean, you know, I read the popular press too, and I understand the criticisms of the science, but I'll tell you, those guys are working really hard on this science. They work a little harder than I did as a lawyer sometimes to really get it right. You know, so I mean, they're really working really hard, and I'm extremely impressed by the work that's being done now, not only in the global context, but in the U.S. context, to really think through what these models and scientific assessments are for climate impacts at the scale, and they're really struggling with these issues of how do you make that climate information relevant at the regional and local level, and I think that'll be one of the main spin-offs, and I think increasing attention to that. Again, they do analyze the effects of global changes. It's absolutely a global issue. We can't, unfortunately, Connecticut's not going to be able to solve the problem. So you do need to have that global level of issue, but it shouldn't do that. They are really trying to advance that, and they're also analyzing the trends of both global change and human-induced and natural. So they are really, the transition in this assessment is really to think about more than the global change issues, but the human-induced and natural. So some of those issues I was talking about, the compounding factors. So they're thinking more now about those compounding factors, recognizing that mitigation alone is certainly not going to solve the problem, because climate's going to change even if we stop everything now. So it's changing, and it's changing whether or not you know exactly what the causes are. So again, this is just saying a lot of people are involved. A lot of people involved. They're really working on this, and they're trying to come up with some reports. Our draft report, I'm working on a coastal human vulnerability subsection. I think you're working on the Northeast Regional chapter. There's a variety of other very specific sector issues. These are all inputs, technical inputs, that will go into this National Climate Assessment. So they're getting my 200-hour huge team of folks working on it. 200-page report will be, I think, summarized in 8 pages as a coastal chapter within the final National Climate Assessment. But again, they're really doing the best to really pull in. Unfortunately, I'm more the editor. I have a lot of smart people who are writing the chapter, but trying to figure out some of these strategies. I think some of the drafts will start being available, I think, this summer, and then hopefully we'll have a more public focus. And I really want to talk about, because I really do, I'm just very excited about the degree of energy and commitment that this shows to this adaptation portfolio. So that there is, you know, again, I think there will be increasing support for whatever actions you're talking about, because I'm seeing not only at the national and international level just an incredible commitment to be thinking about these climate change issues in terms of adaptation and supporting communities. So I'll kind of zip through some of this. Again, we're looking at impacts on coastal settlements. I don't need to talk about that. There's lots of statistics about inputs. If I take something away from this slide or something I like to push is, I do think your infrastructure trust funds and your highway trust funds, there's going to be money there. We don't have as much money as we used to, but people are going to be, they're still going to be worried about highways and sewage treatment plants and facilities, and the American Society of Civil Engineers are telling us where those things are reaching their sort of useful life anyway. So capitalizing our investment in those issues, I think, is going to be important. Thinking about, as I'm pushing the vulnerability and the impacts on human development, I think that's just important. These integrated hazard assessments that are looking at environmental stressors, social vulnerability in terms of at-risk populations, I think is something, those type of vulnerability assessments would certainly, I think, be really a high-value way and a different way of thinking, a more comprehensive way of thinking about these issues in the future. In the insurance industry, I just want to mention quickly, I do think they get it. I mean, the climate change, they're doing it. You're going to see this more and more. The insurance industries have that as part of their portfolio. Increasingly, the SEC is requiring disclosures of businesses on the climate impacts of their investment decisions. So again, behind the financial and industry communities, talking with those communities, I think they're a little bit ahead of the curve in thinking about that. But really, what's the actionable climate relationship between some of their policies and what local governments might do? Again, public disclosure, I think, is sort of important. That you're going to have material risks and policies. You're a lot of stuff like that could make significance. So understanding where that is going for the state and your property owners is important. Real estate, obviously, significant impacts there on coastal floodings. This issue of more restrictive zoning. Zoning is not a really popular word in New Jersey. Regulation is not a really popular word in New Jersey. But trying to figure out, there's still good things to do. So trying to figure out how to address that. So what are the real economic trends? What's going to drive real estate investment? I'm trying to do a regional with my real estate institute at Monmouth University. We're trying to actually really, where do people want to live? Do they really want to live in the floodplain? So we're trying to figure out how to create incentives for people to live in places and not necessarily zone them in and out. So a couple of key messages to conclude is, again, climate science is incredibly important, but I think for local decision makers, it's not the critical path constraint. More and more science is really probably not going to help you that much more. You just need the right science at the right scale at the right level to help you make the decisions that you need to make whenever you need to make them, or at least that's the feedback we're getting from some of the local communities that we met with. So we need to get on with the climate risk management job. This is a risk management thing. We really understand that. Understand risk trade-offs. Certainly a discussion that needs to be done. We need to get on with that risk management and adaptation about risk management and at a variety of different scales. The science tends to be somewhat different, so we need to be thinking about really what is useful for science to improve the understanding. Ways of measuring success, again, putting within your adaptation terms, what is success for adaptation? Over what period of time? So you measure success and these vulnerability assessments that I mentioned earlier, and linking with science to be sure that you can be adaptive in your adaptation. So again, this is really nice at this conference. The finding of this thing, should we revisit our current laws and regulations? Do they support us in the way that we need to go? Or are they impediments, and how can we make them change? We do need more effective structures to promote communication. Who are you communicating to? Who are your audiences? This is an important audience, but probably there are other people you need to influence. You guys, local folks, aren't going to be able to make decisions unless you bring other folks along as well. Expand community of practice. Again, this is really not about coastal management only. It's about a lot of other different things to broaden that community of practice as well. Participatory vulnerability. Again, this is a participatory process. It's not about developing the science and the likely value of connecting climate responses and others to sustainability agendas and broader sustainability agendas that I think are already embedded in a lot of community planning and other issues. So the good news, he says, hopefully is, and this is sort of, we're on Australia, so you got to think really, the good stuff's going to happen, right? If we say it. So our science has identified the threats pretty early. We know more than enough to really do this. We know enough to take action now, and I think we'll talk about some strategies during the next day, for the rest of the day. We have identified a myriad of helpful adaptation management approaches and potentials for innovation and technology. It's really a cool time to be working in this area because I think the science and policy is poised to follow your lead and to support you. And I do think we have the moral compass, and maybe you're in this place, that we do have a moral compass that tells us that we care not only about those today's, but those our collective future as well. So, it's really important to keep that in mind and reminding folks that that's what we're talking about. So when it seemed too complicated and hard becomes what simply must be done. So look forward, thank you again for inviting me and appreciate being here. Thanks.